So thank you for joining us. You have found yourself at the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. I am Danielle Hubley. I'm our Advocacy and Education Manager with the Partnership for Strong Communities. I also have with me Sean Gaio from the, also our Senior Policy Advisor from the Partnership for Strong Communities. We are here to support you if you have any tech troubles or have any questions for the running of today's conference. Don't hesitate to reach out to either of us or any other partnership staff you see. But the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference features local, state, national experts leading conversations, exploring challenges, sharing best practices, and coalescing us around critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues in our state. This year, the conference is focused on building stability, and each session is spotlighting unique approaches to strengthening housing stability for households and communities across Connecticut. If you're not already joining us on Twitter, you can follow us at PSC Housing. And we are using a hashtag for today, yesterday, and tomorrow, hashtag CAHC 2022. So we hope you join in on the conversation. Today's session, with the session you are at right now, is called Fair Housing Enforcement and Housing Stability, Preserving Housing Through a Fair Housing Lens. And before we turn it over to our presenters to get it started, I just want to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing, Connecticut Finance Housing Authority, La Rosa Building Group, the Melville Charitable Trust, and Wells Fargo. We couldn't do all of this work without their deep support and funding and support of the conference this year. We also want to thank our collaborating sponsors. We have a great wealth of them and are so grateful for their support. And last, as well, our supporting sponsors, who we also have a wealth of and are very grateful for their support and coordination with us in pulling together this conference. And last but not least, the Connecticut Fair Housing Center is today's session sponsor. So thank you so much for being here and supporting this work. And we're so grateful to have you with us. Before I move on to our presenters, just a few quick housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded. We will make all recordings available as soon as possible to our YouTube, our PSC Housing YouTube account. So please check out that if you want to see the content following the conference. All participants have entered today's session muted. Please remain on mute unless speakers ask you to unmute. And if you have any technology issues or you want to raise a question for the conversation, please use the chat icon in your Zoom control panel and send it to either myself or Sean if you're having tech issues, and again, open to the full panel for the conversation today. Your speakers will let you know how they want content questions to be submitted. And very quickly, post-session, you can complete a session feedback survey by clicking on the megaphone icon in the lobby next to your name. We always really appreciate your feedback and encourage you to take a moment to just fill out that quick couple question survey responding to how these sessions went. We also have housing data profiles. We've been updating them, and so the updated version is now available to you. Each housing data profile contains a summary of important housing data in a town, and you can get fast facts on affordable housing or do a deep dive into the distribution of your city's housing costs. We'll drop a link in the chat so you can check that out, but this will allow you to access all the latest housing data for Connecticut's towns and cities in an online and interactive format. So with all of that great information, I am going to kick it off to our panelists today, and I'll hand it over to Rashida to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you guys for joining us today. I am just gonna get my screen share even though Danielle, I'm having a little bit of issues with screen share. It's saying that it was disabled. But I'm just going to jump right in. My name is Rashida Rattray. I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator over at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. And I'm your moderator today as we embark on a conversation with regards to fair housing enforcement and how it plays a huge role in the preservation of affordable housing. And I'm just going to get this share. Hopefully you guys are able to see my presentation. Let's make it full screen.
I can see it now. Just so you know, Rashida, your volume is a little bit garbled on my end, but not sure you can do anything about that. Just be mindful of that.
What I will do is I will probably just take myself off of camera, if that's okay, because it will make it a little bit easier for you guys to hear me, hopefully.
That is better. That is better, Rashida. Thank you.
Awesome. And you guys are able to see the PowerPoint clearly, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. So it is no secret that we are currently in the throes of an affordable housing crisis. In fact, more than 2/3 extremely low-income households in Connecticut spend more than 50% of their income on housing. This is because Connecticut has only 4 affordable housing units for every 10 extremely low-income households that need one. How do we get us out of the situation that we're in? One obvious answer would be to build more housing. Unfortunately, housing discrimination can obstruct the creation of new housing, present a barrier to the preservation of affordable housing, and displace members of protected classes from existing housing. For this reason, and many more, enforcing the Fair Housing Act protects vulnerable populations across the state and is a key to the creation and maintenance of affordable housing stock. But really, what is fair housing, right? So we can say, fair housing helps and fair housing is great, but it isn't until we define fair housing that we're able to understand why it is so helpful. Fair housing is the right to choose housing free from unlawful discrimination. Federal and state fair housing laws were put in place to protect people from discrimination in housing transactions such as rentals, sales, lending, and insurance. Fair housing ensures access for everyone and is an integral ingredient in ensuring housing equity, making it possible for all people to live wherever they can afford to live. It guarantees that regardless of your age, your race, religion, family situation, or level of ability, you have the right to choose the housing that is best for your needs, with no outside preferences or a little bit about the Connecticut Housing Center. Our mission is to ensure that all people across the state of Connecticut have equal access to housing opportunities that are free from discrimination. We know that a lot of the issues that we see do not operate in separate silos, right? There's an intersectionality to everything that we do. So we focus on the intersection of poverty and housing discrimination. We also assist Connecticut foreclosure crisis. So to look at the work that we do, we offer foreclosure prevention and intervention services to families and individuals who may be facing foreclosure, risk of foreclosure. I spearhead the Education and Outreach Initiative, and the goal is to in the state, any proximity to housing at all knows that we exist as a resource to report housing information. Our policy advocacy section of work focuses on maintaining policies in place that has a positive effect on housing and making sure that housing act and all of these other policies that are in place stay in place, and also making sure that we're advocating for more equitable policy where there isn't any. Our tenant empowerment section is one of our newest sections of work. One that I'm most excited about. We know that eviction can often allow tenants to feel disempowered. So through our tenant empowerment section of work, we're able to
I think we might have lost Rashida's audio feed. Hi, Greg Kirshner, Connecticut Fair Housing. Our tenant empowerment work is really focused on working within the community to build up capacity for tenants to organize and support themselves and to affect positive change. So we believe that there's a great intersection between people experiencing the brunt of the affordable housing crisis and civil rights, because there's a tremendous amount of overlap between the protected classes and folks who would benefit from affordable housing, largely as a result of having been historically locked out of affordable housing opportunities that occurred over past generations through government policies and as the result of government assistance in terms of availability of affordable mortgages and expansion of housing opportunities in the suburbs in the past. I think we have lost our PowerPoint with Rashida dropping off, but I trust that Pam is able to go ahead without the PowerPoint. And so let me turn it over to Pamela Heller, staff attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, who will talk a little bit about the center's experience with what the community is experiencing in terms of housing discrimination.
And Greg, I actually have, this is Chelsea, I have your PowerPoint, so I'm just getting that queued up for you, and I'll get to the slides for Maria in just a second. You can start talking, Maria, and I'll get that up for you.
Great, thank you. So I know that Rashida was going to ask a few questions, but I can just go ahead and sort of, launch into some information that I wanted to share today. So Rashida, if you join back, feel free to interrupt and keep going as we had planned. But so my name is Pamela Heller. I'm a staff attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. And I want to talk today about some of the trends that we're seeing through our intakes. Because I think it's very illuminating in terms of what's happening across the state, as well as the ways that the center and the Fair Housing Act can help, achieve our goals of equal access to housing and affordable housing for all. So, Chelsea, I'm not sure if you can go to the next slide, please. Great. So I put together a little bit of information about our intakes, and I'll just explain what this is showing. So this is all of our intakes from 2015 to the present. And the green are, just our general fair housing intakes, and those can be a lot of different things. So, I could break this down a lot further, but I think it's useful to see, like, these are just the general fair housing intakes, and you can see that between 2015 and 2022, the green portion hasn't changed very much. The blue portion are folks who are contacting us with other landlord-tenant issues that are not strictly housing discrimination related. So, from 2015 to 2019, those were really small numbers, and you can barely see the blue. And then in 2020 and through today, it has jumped, to be basically to double the number of intakes that we have. And you can also see that in 2022, we've had more intakes in total already this year than in any other year. And our landlord-tenant intakes are also the highest they've ever been. So, what this is telling us is that there is a very strong demand for landlord-tenant assistance. And so what does that mean? Like what are people asking us? So the probably number one issue that tenants are calling us about is about conditions in their units. And I have, many of us have heard the term quiet quitting. Well, I have coined quiet evicting, which is what I'm seeing a lot of landlords do, where they basically just stop making repairs to properties, and they, allow tenants to, basically flounder trying to figure out what they can do to make the landlord fix the problems. And the current legal system that's set up for that is very weak, and does not give a lot of assistance to tenants. So people leave, right? Because they are facing really poor conditions that they just can't get fixed. So that's you didn't have to file an eviction case if you just stop fixing everything. It pushes people out. And of course, in terms of a fair housing perspective, this becomes a major issue for people who are using housing vouchers. So, and the reason is that, number one, if you have a housing voucher and your landlord refuses to make repairs, ultimately the housing authority will stop paying the landlord and you will have to move. You will have no choice. And you could risk losing your voucher if in fact you don't move. So that is, something, that specifically affects people based on their source of income. And it also, because prices are going up, it means that if you have a voucher, it's all the more difficult to move out of a place with poor conditions. So it puts you in, really a tight situation where your options are fairly limited. And we know that because of that, it leads to increased economic and racial segregation when people have to use their vouchers only in areas where housing is affordable and available. So conditions are a big thing. The other issue is, of course, rent increases. And these two issues go hand in hand, because almost everyone who contacts us about a rent increase also says, and my landlord is not even fixing stuff. They want a rent increase, and they, aren't going to fix anything. So Rashida's back. Rashida, I've just kind of been going into, some intake stuff, but I know that you had some specific questions that you wanted to ask. I'm happy to turn it back over to you for that if you'd like.
That's perfect, Pam. Actually, I was going to ask you about the intake stuff. So what I did want to ask was that since you have the firsthand perspective on experiences that people are having with housing discrimination through the intake line, to just give us some examples of what you are seeing.
Yeah, great. So I was just mentioning rent increases as being a big problem. And again, these are problems that are not strictly housing discrimination and may not violate the fair housing laws, but they do lead to increased economic and racial segregation. So with housing costs going up and people unable to stay in the housing of their choice due to that increase, they have to seek housing that is affordable, and that concentrates poverty and leads to increased race segregation as well. So that's one of the issues that we're concerned about in terms of rent increases. But a lot of times there's not much that can be done legally about a rent increase. So however, there is one important protection that's available to people, which is the good cause protection. So specific groups of people are protected from unreasonable rent increases, and those are people with disabilities or people who are 62 and over and live in a building with 5 or more units. So those folks do have some protections, and we're getting a lot of calls from people in that category of protected people who still the landlord is trying to push them out. And again, if they can't get a rent increase, then they'll just stop making repairs and push people out a different way. So these are all things that we're really concerned about. And just the general increase in problems, that my slides demonstrate is a significant concern for housing stability.
Thank you so much, Pam. We know that source of income is a protected class here in Connecticut, but there have been significant barriers that affect voucher holders looking for housing. Can you discuss some of those barriers? Who is being affected by them, and highlight how they promote housing instability?
Absolutely. So before I jump into that, because I did touch on that a little bit, but before I get back into source of income, we've moved to the next slide, which is just, I also wanted to demonstrate our average number of intakes, because it shows the real increase that we've seen. So between 2015 and 2019, total intakes averaged, excuse me, I'm sorry. Glad we're not in person. So anyway, our average intakes between 2015 and 2019 were 625 per year. And now since the pandemic, we've escalated to an average number of over 1,000 intakes per year. So, and a lot of that is, as we saw on the prior slide, made up by people who have landlord-tenant issues, as their presenting issue. It doesn't mean that they don't have housing discrimination as well, but the main issues are these landlord-tenant conflicts regarding conditions and rent increases, as I mentioned, being the biggest ones. The other thing that, in terms of, source of income, how that plays into it, a lot of the folks who have vouchers are just struggling to find housing that they can afford. And so a lot of people are contacting us and saying, I'm going to lose my voucher because I can't find a place to live. And sometimes those folks are being discriminated against. And in those situations, the fair housing laws do offer protection, which we can use to their advantage. But, a lot of times the places that are available just aren't affordable with their voucher. So it's not really an issue of discrimination necessarily, but it's an issue of can the voucher cover this property? And then, of course, as I mentioned before, conditions. So if landlords, have not maintained properties or are not willing to make repairs, that also comes up as a barrier for people to use vouchers. Although, again, the Fair Housing Act can sometimes help in those situations. So, so we're seeing a lot of difficulty with people finding housing with vouchers, and then we're also seeing difficulty once they found a place with rent increases as well, because if the housing authority won't pay for the rent increase that a landlord is demanding, it can cause problems and force people to move. So those are some of the ways that we're seeing, the sort of intersection between source of income issues and the landlord-tenant conflicts that are most frequently coming to us.
Thank you so much, Pam. You mentioned conditions work, and that will lead me to my next question for Maria. Maria, you've been doing some work with tenants to address issues around poor conditions. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Sure, happy to. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so like Pam said, we're hearing a lot from tenants about problems that they're having with poor conditions in their units. And we hear about terrible situations which are affecting people's health. And, a lot of this aren't issues that we can directly help with because it's not technically fair housing. However, because these problems are so common, we really wanted to try and look for other ways to address them because they are seriously affecting low-income communities of color, people with disabilities, and other people who are our clients. So when we think about how to address poor conditions that people are living with, the first thing is it's so hard for people to get an advocate or a lawyer to help them. Legal aid doesn't do these cases. We typically don't do this kind of work, and private attorneys don't do this kind of work. So if tenants are living in properties where the conditions are dangerous or unsanitary, they're pretty much on their own, and they need to use structures that have been set up to address these issues. But unfortunately, those structures and systems don't always work that well. So what are the structures that are available to folks? Under the law, each city and town is responsible for enforcing laws around conditions in rental units. It's the state sanitary code that guides sort of what is considered safe and healthy in housing and what is not. But many towns and cities do not really do that work as well as they could. Tenants can make a complaint to the town or city, and then an inspector should come and look and see what's happening in the unit. And if there are violations, they should order the landlord to fix them. And then if the landlord doesn't fix the problems, the city or town should fine them or take them to court. And that, unfortunately, just doesn't happen very often. So when the landlords are not cited, tenants continue to live with these horrible conditions that make them and their kids sick and really affect their ability to thrive. And then if you live in public or subsidized housing, oftentimes, not always, but cities and towns will not get involved in ordering landlords to fix conditions either. So when these systems don't work well, one of the only other things that people can do is get together with other tenants and organize to build power, to fight back, and to demand that the landlords and the towns and cities be accountable and really work for everybody. So we have started to get involved with and support organizing that's happening around the state. That's being led by the DSA, which is the Democratic Socialists of America, and their Connecticut chapter, as well as other organizers with Make the Road and other organizations to build and support tenant unions. And currently there are about 7 tenant unions that are active in the state. And I'll give you an example of how organizing can help tenants and be one of the ways to help people preserve affordable housing that they can live in. I've been working with a group in Hartford. There are 24 units. In June actually of this year, a new landlord bought the property. He refused to give people leases, and he told everyone that he's raising the rent by $200, which is about 30%. You know, people had not been paying more than $900 a month, and everyone got a notice saying their rent would go up. We researched this landlord and saw that he has a history of buying properties, evicting all the tenants, fixing up the units, and flipping the building. So we thought this is kind of what he's up to here. And there were very poor conditions. And, you know, he would not address them, sort of hoping, like Pam said, that people would just move out so that he could then fix up the property and jack up the rents. The tenants got together with help from an organizer. They started to talk to each other and figure out what can they do to address this problem. Almost all the tenants wrote a letter and signed this letter to the landlord, telling him, we'll agree to a rent increase if you'll first fix the poor conditions. These two buildings had leaks in the ceilings and walls, water coming through those leaks, ceilings in danger of falling, electrical problems, mold, broken windows, unsecured doors, broken appliances, etc. So they send this letter and the landlord never responds. They sent him a second letter then, and they said, we formed a tenant union and we'd like to meet with you to address these issues. And 2 days later, 5 tenants got notices to quit, which is the first stage in the eviction process. At the same time, many of the tenants called code enforcement, reporting the poor conditions and asking for an inspection. Then the landlord, after the time was up for the notice to quit, filed 2 evictions in court for these 5 tenants. So because the tenants had told the landlord that they had formed a union and they had called code enforcement, the eviction action legally was considered retaliatory, and the tenants were able to defend themselves from the eviction, which the landlord eventually withdrew in court. Many of these tenants had lived there for over 10 years. They don't miss their rent payments, and they don't deserve to be displaced because somebody decides they want to use their home to make a profit. And for these tenants, the situation is ongoing. A number of tenants have filed a case to pay their rent into court, which is one process that people can use to force the landlord to fix the conditions. Others have filed complaints with the Fair Rent Commission, and I'm going to talk about that as a tool. And organizing is one way to force these systems to deal with these problems and to be accountable so that people don't have to live in these terrible conditions, so people don't get displaced. Organizing brings the situation into the public eye, to public officials, to the press. And, it's a way to build a movement that stands up for tenants while making politicians and systems accountable to them, because everybody deserves safe and affordable housing. And if we really believe that, we need to take on those who see housing as a way to just make money, because a lot of people are going to end up with nowhere to live. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to put up the first slide, Rashida, that I've got that talks about rents going up. Great. I mean, here's a slide which shows, I think this is from 2015. Rents are going up so high. This was even before the pandemic, and we know that recently, things are much, much worse. Most people cannot afford a 1-bedroom if they have a minimum wage job. So we're in a real crisis here with this situation. It's okay, Rashida, if I talk about the fair housing, the fair rent commissions?
Absolutely, because I really want to point people in the direction of what they can do and what resources are currently available to help them with regards to unjust rental increases.
Okay, so there was the workshop before us was talking a lot about fair rent commissions, and I wasn't listening to the entire thing, unfortunately, but for those of you who weren't in that workshop, a Fair Rent Commission is a municipal board, and it has the power to prevent rent charges in residential housing that are, quote, so excessive with due regard to all the circumstances as to be harsh and unconscionable. So there are laws on the books that require certain towns and cities to have fair rent commissions. They hold hearings, they make decisions in response to complaints. And this year, a law was passed to expand what towns and cities have fair rent commissions. And you could put that slide up now, Rashida, if you'd like, and so folks can see that.
It's up.
Okay, great. So, you know, this is one tool. Well, maybe I'll just address this slide really quickly. Whoops, if I can get back there. As you can see, you know, the towns that have them now, Hartford, New Haven, Stamford, Bridgeport, there's, you know, this group of towns listed in the center of the slide. And then as of, I think it's the middle of this year, I'm sorry, I don't have that right in front of me, but the law requires all towns over 25,000 residents to create a fair rent commission. So a lot of new places will need to have these commissions to help people address rents going up. And I'm going to try and get through this really quick because I know we don't have a ton of time. You know, if people file a complaint with the Fair Rent Commission, the law also says if your landlord retaliates against you after that, it's illegal. So filing a complaint provides some protection. Once you file a complaint, your rent won't go up until the complaint is resolved. And as you know, the workshop previous to us talked about, this is an organizing tool as well. But unfortunately, it doesn't always work well. Sometimes the commissions don't know what the rules are. And it's really important that organizing as well as residents push these commissions to do what the law allows them to do. And I'll say that, you know, we definitely need more legislation to address issues that facing tenants, because if rents go up so high that people can't afford them, where are people going to live? What happens to these families that are evicted and can't pay these high rents? We need fair rent commissions in every town and city that's affected by this issue, and we need these commissions to do their job to make sure that rents aren't going up in an unfair way. And obviously, you know, homelessness is going to surge. So having people organize and get together to fight back is super important to make sure that, you know, people who live in Connecticut can continue to live here and thrive and be able to afford a decent place to live. So I think my contact info is on the slide on the bottom there. You know, people can shoot me an email. There's a toolkit on creating fair rent commissions. You know, if people are interested in information on how to organize, I'm happy to point you in the right direction, and happy to take questions after Greg does his presentation. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Greg Kirshner, Connecticut Fair Housing Center. Thank you for your interest in this topic. I'm just going to talk for a little bit about kind of the life cycle of how opposition can derail housing opportunities for people based on their protected class status. In 1988, when Congress amended the Fair Housing Act to add disability as a protected class, it did so for the express purpose of ending the use of negative stereotypes as a reason for denying housing opportunities to people who want to live in the community. So in 2015, Gilead Community Services, which is a social services organization that has almost a half a century now serving the folks of Middlesex County in need of disability-related services, moved to open a group home in Cromwell, Connecticut. It was a great opportunity. It would permanently expand through a DEMIS contract the number of beds available for people who are ready to transition from inpatient care to community setting. to learn to live independently through the use of supports provided by Gilead. And Gilead went about purchasing a beautiful single-family home, preparing it to be able to house 6 people in their own bedrooms, and offering the opportunity for housing in the community. And the original internal response of members of the municipality, when they began to hear some rumblings that community members were opposed to it, was, well, they'll have to get over it. They have the right to live there. You have the next slide, Rashida. But the community opposition intensified. There was a change.org petition asking the group home not to be located there because there are, quote, too many children in the neighborhood. And then public outcry reached a crescendo in a public meeting where officials from Gilead and from the State Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services came to talk about the group home and the benefits it would provide. And what the mayor of Cromwell later described as an angry mob expressed their opposition to that happening. Based on this opposition, we can go to the next slide, the tone of the municipality changed. As you can see here, it became the policy of the mayor and the town to say that they did not want this group home in this neighborhood. In other settings, they said, the mayor said, we do not want this home in this neighborhood or anywhere in town. So following that change in attitude driven by community opposition, the town took action. We have the next slide. That included various zoning enforcement actions, petitioning the state to try to derail it, failing to provide other benefits and services to the home, and ultimately resulted in the group home closing. Only 2 men ever got to live there for a total of about 5 weeks before Gilead, under the pressure from the town, decided it could not provide a healthy living place for its clients, and so had to close, resulting in, as described in the press, Cromwell residents praising the town council. Subsequent to that, there was an election, and one of the candidates for town council had an op-ed that stated part of his platform was making sure that a situation like Gilead never happened again. And sadly, that meant opening of a group home, not the reaction and closing of the group home. Gilead decided that it couldn't let this sort of public discrimination stand unchallenged, and so the Fair Housing Center in Gilead did bring a Fair Housing Act claim against the town of Cromwell, which took a number of years to resolve, but was litigated in federal court before a jury. And if you can go to the next slide, which resulted in a jury awarding $5 million in punitive damages against the town of Cromwell for its actions to block the operation of the group home. Now, this is an important and meaningful consequence for the discrimination that occurred. But unfortunately, it does not make up for the fact that the true victims and the long-lasting damage that occurred was to potential residents of the Gilead group home, Gilead, the state, and all of us. Because when Gilead canceled that group home, the contract that Demas had, which the legislature had passed back in 2014, was revoked and ended. And that source of funding disappeared. And we don't know when or if it'll ever be restored or another contract will happen. So those 6 beds, once a contract is put in place and a house opens, they typically stay open for a very long time and they're continually funded. That funding is now gone and we don't know when it will return. So while this is important that there are consequences for discrimination, clearly the goal is for discrimination never to occur in the first place. Around the same time that this case was going on, there was a provider of group home services that operates primarily in the Waterbury area for older people with mental health disabilities. And they sought to consolidate 2 of their homes in Waterbury into a single home in Wolcott, Connecticut, providing a more suburban, leafy experience for their residents, consolidating 2 rental homes into 1 building that they would control and had retrofitted by a local developer to suit their needs. It had previously been a group home for adolescents for more than 20 years, was off the tax rolls in that capacity. The new owner, Self Inc., planned to pay taxes on this home, so return it to the rolls of Wolcott. But despite that, it generated opposition from the community. If we can go to the next slide. So, for example, this posting asking folks to join neighbors in opposition to voice their concern about a, quote, large psychiatric residence to be located in the community. So that was also challenged. We brought a complaint on behalf of the provider and the developers alongside the Department of Justice. And actually go to the next slide, be a little bit clearer, Rashida, I think. And that case was resolved ultimately. In that case, the town wound up paying $350,000 to compensate the plaintiffs for the delay, the multi-year delay in being able to operate the group home. The happy part of this story is that the developer in that case was fully supportive of the group home provider, kept the home open for them until they could move in. And so once the case was finally resolved in December, the clients were able to move into this great new housing opportunity. So somewhat mitigating the effects of the discrimination that occurred. But these are just a couple of examples and sort of typical examples of what community opposition can do to housing choice for others solely because of who they are, who they're perceived to be. And it is, something that occurs even when it may be against the self-interest of the municipality, the self-interest of the community. We all need these kinds of services to be available. The folks of Wolcott would benefit from increased taxes being paid in their community, but none of that could overcome the negative stereotypes that are connected to people with disabilities that led to this opposition. So that's just a little bit of a trip through the life cycle of discriminatory opposition that may derail housing for folks, and I'll turn it back over to Rashida.
Thank you so much, Greg. Given those examples that you provided to us, what is the role of litigation in promoting the goals of the fair housing laws?
Sure. Yeah, litigation is the last resort. As I indicated with regards to the Gilead case, it's important to vindicate the civil rights of the residents and of Gilead. So bringing such a case is important, but oftentimes it doesn't result in the housing being created. We see across the country really important cases around affordable housing development that is derailed by opposition, often based in racism and stereotypes against people based on their income or their race or national origin. And when that litigation is successful, it usually is after 5 or 10 years or 20 years of litigation in which that housing has not been created, the costs increase, affordability in communities becomes worse, segregation becomes intensified. So it's a necessary part. It can hopefully play a role in changing attitudes by exacting a price for discrimination. But clearly the goal is to avoid this type of obstruction from the start. And I could talk a little bit about that, Rashida. And really what we all need to do is be participatory. We need to figure out what is the opposite of an angry mob. So when an angry mob descends on town officials, who is there to counteract that? It involves talking to our neighbors, showing attitudes that are inclusive and accepting. It's really about participating in public hearings, testifying, providing a different perspective from the NIMBY perspective or the discriminatory perspective. As I said, this is not unique to group homes. This is a dynamic that happens in pretty much every affordable housing development proposal or other proposal to change living patterns in our state and in our country. So it really is on all of us to play our part as community members to try to make sure that these discriminatory acts don't happen in our neighborhoods.
Thank you so much, Greg. You mentioned being participatory, and I know that we have some questions in the chat box that I do want to get to. But one question that I kind of wanted to shoot over to Maria and Pam, since you mentioned some really good steps or some key things that people can do to be involved. What are some things, Maria, or maybe one thing you think that someone could do if, being in this session right now, getting this information and kind of wanting to take the next step in, maybe furthering the Fair Housing Act or helping, the work that we do? What is one step that you would give someone who would be interested in getting involved in the work that we do?
Maybe Pam, you could go. I'm not quite sure. I'm not ready for that question.
Tell your town to start the Fair Rent Commission if they don't have one already. And if they do have one, make sure that they are, following the rules and actually taking people's complaints and ensuring that they are taking complaints regarding public housing as well. And just get on your town officials. We did that in my town, and they started one, and apparently it's working well. So it does work on that local level.
Yeah, and I thought also, people could show up at city council meetings. Tenants are often showing up and talking about issues. We need to hold our government more accountable for what's happening out there and support folks who are trying to change the systems that aren't working for people. So yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I see a question in the chat box from Sheila, and it says, does anyone see an end to the wave of rent increases in CT? And I'm not sure who wants to.
No, I don't see an end to it, unfortunately, because, this isn't new, and it is, might the increases be smaller going forward? That's possible if interest rates continue to rise and the demand for housing decreases, which obviously could also be helped by building more housing. So those factors will, contribute to rents, but they're going to keep going up. It's just a question of by how much. But for the foreseeable future, I think this is going to continue to be an issue for folks in Connecticut.
Thank you so much for that, Pam. Greg, Maria, any additions to that question before we move on?
No, I think that's probably beyond my ability to prognosticate about, one would think that there is a tipping point at which people simply can't afford the rents, and, that leads to more consolidation of households or people leaving the state. But all the things Pam pointed out, Connecticut has not been great about expanding its stock of housing. So I think we all have an interest in making sure that that we have affordable housing available to everybody who needs it.
Got you. What kind of legislation do you think would be helpful?
Well, the sky's the limit. The question is what can be passed, but what could be helpful? There's plenty of options. We could have more controls on who could be evicted. We could have legislation that deals with the rent amounts. It's currently illegal in Connecticut to have rent control. Maybe it's time to revisit that because, if folks cannot afford the rent, I don't know what's going to happen. There could be more legislation around, helping people get into housing who might have a barrier like a criminal record or poor credit. All sorts of things could be done to help tenants find housing and stay in housing. It's just a matter of whether we have the will and whether people get active and, make their feelings and opinions known with their fellow citizens. I don't know if Pam or Greg have other ideas.
Yeah, I think, presently landlords can evict people for no reason, a lapse of time eviction when their lease is up. That is obviously problematic for housing stability for, in particularly families with children. It can also be used as a cover for discriminatory reasons to evict. Maybe the landlord wants to evict someone because they have children or because they have disabilities or they don't like their religion, and they can do so simply by saying, we're evicting you because your lease is up. Limiting evictions to instances where there's good cause, lease violation or non-payment of rent, would be something that would provide more stability for tenants and would combat hidden discrimination. More housing, need more housing. There is a push growing together. Connecticut is working on creating a toolkit and legislative guidance and a framework to make sure that municipalities are meeting the needs of their citizens and meeting the needs of the citizens of the state in providing options for affordable housing. So supporting efforts like that is certainly important as well.
Thank you so much. We do have one more question, but it's like a couple of questions in the chat box from Sean. Do courts ever order municipalities to ensure the original group home proposal is funded and created? Is that possible? Is there a legislative proposal that could impact this? Unfortunately.
Yeah, I think, Sean, that one of the challenges here is that the funding is coming from the state. The state in this instance did not participate in the discrimination, so they would not be under the jurisdiction of the court. So yeah, there is that kind of loophole there, that the relief is a little bit harder to fashion. My belief is that the jury saw that and intended for this award to compensate for that loss of funding, but it is difficult to fashion relief that is indefinite when you have a more specific legal framework that you're working under in terms of a particular case. We certainly hope that large awards against municipalities that discriminate will discourage that behavior. And in this instance, punitive damages cannot be paid by insurance. That's against the public policy in Connecticut. So a punitive damage award has to be paid by the person that it's awarded against. So that does serve a greater deterrent effect, or at least we hope so.
Thank you, Greg. And one last question: what can councils or mayors do locally?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in on that one quickly, and hopefully the others will jump in too if you have any ideas. But I mean, code enforcement, which is, the mechanism to make sure that landlords fix poor conditions, all of that is a municipal issue. So mayors and city councils can allocate money so that there are enough inspectors. In Hartford, there's a proposal that said that certain landlords' properties are going to be inspected by the town and they're going to get a certificate to show that they're in good condition. And there are ways for the cities and towns to make sure that these systems are working, so that when landlords, when there are poor conditions or things are broken, the city or town orders the landlords to fix them and punishes them if they don't. It's not fair that landlords get away with this. So towns and cities have a big role in making sure that that system works well. And the fair rent commissions are the same. They need to be funded. They need to work right. They need to enforce the law correctly to help tenants with these issues.
Yeah, I would just say also that, we see a lot of conflict over 8-30G and affordable housing. We live in a state that is very segregated, has been segregated as a result of, formerly official policies and now by practice and custom. And it's really important that municipalities, councils, and mayors look at what their obligations are and look at what properly running their community is. So understanding that providing affordable housing is part of their mission and is part of serving their community well. If you're concerned about, the burdens of 8-30G, well, you've had 30, 40 years to come up with a plan for how to meet the needs for affordable housing where developers wouldn't need to or be able to rely on 8-30G. So embrace that role. Integration, recognize that racial and economic integration are an obligation that you have as someone who's sworn an oath to the state and federal constitution, and see that as a public good and a necessity, and embrace that and promote things that will improve on our poor record in that regard. So I really do think it takes an attitude change to see that, the role of municipal leaders is not to maintain a status quo exactly the way some things have been and some people want it to be, but really seeing the bigger picture, the greater good, and really what your moral and legal obligations are. Never mind the fact that they all serve an important economic role and economic benefit in preserving the ability of people to live and work in the state.
Thank you so much for that, Greg. And with that, we are at time. We're at 10:59 a.m. and I don't want to.
All right. Well, I guess I'll say the final thank yous on behalf of the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. Sorry that Rashida's had some technical issues here, but thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all. Look us up and contact us if you have any questions or any concerns about what's happening in your community. And we'll pat ourselves on the back for being done right at 11 a.m. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.